The late 1950s and early 1960s were certainly the jet age of American automobile design, and designers embraced this jet age by coming up with very interesting, shall we say, and far-reaching themes for new vehicles. Chrysler perhaps embraced this trend most visibly and early on with the introduction of its 1957 model lineup, the so-called forward-look Chryslers, where Chrysler proclaimed in its advertising, suddenly it's 1960. But fins in the jet age definitely spread to other makes and models, including at General Motors, where designers were candidly trying to outdo Chrysler in its 1957 designs when it came to the 1959 model year. So for this reason, the GM effectively tore up its original plans for the 1959 model year and put all new vehicles on the road in a hurry to try to compete with what Chrysler had in the showroom. In some cases, these 1959 models sold quite well. In others, they frankly did not. Over at Buick division, Buick had really took a sales tumble. In 1955, Buick placed third in overall sales across all makes in the U.S. automotive industry and sold almost 740,000 cars in that year. However, by 1960, despite the redesign in 1959 and refreshing in 1960, Buick sold just 254,000 units in that particular model year. So, despite Buick's melt and repour styling that occurred in 1959 and the subsequent refreshing that occurred in 1960, the division just had not captured its previous sales success that it had in the mid-1950s. It seems a bit strange, to be candid, that Buick had so much success in 1955 to begin with, even beating out Plymouth in that year. But in the 1955 model year, the mid-price vehicles were doing quite well, and by the time the late 1950s rolled around, the economy was in a much different position than it was just a few years earlier, going into a recession. Perhaps one statistic most epitomizes the state of the U.S. auto industry as well as the overall economy in 1960, and that is that Rambler outsold Buick by nearly 2-1 for the 1960 model year. Part of the issue for the 1959 to 60 Buicks is that customers overall didn't believe that they looked like Buicks. Not quite sure what was meant by that, but that was the feedback that General Motors received when it came to the 1959 and 60 models. And so for 1961, GM tried to at least make the vehicles look a little bit more like Buick, although one could say that the 61 Buicks really didn't have any more Buick flair than the previous models. Regardless, the theme for the 1961 Buick really came from the 1958 Oldsmobile, in part because the same designer did the front end. The designer was an individual by the name of Bernie Smith, who designed that bullet nose 1958 Oldsmobile front end, and you can see the similarity to it in the 1961 bullet nose front. GM Design Vice President Bill Mitchell had selected Bernie's design while Bernie was working in an advanced studio, and during a time period in which Bill Mitchell had created a competition between the Buick production studio and the advanced studio. Well, the advanced studio won, and Bernie's design got sent up to the production studio with the mandate that that was the theme for the 1961 Buick. Interestingly, the theme for the 1961 Buick up front would last just 1 year, as the 1962 Buicks would get a new front end. The main reason for this was that the 1961 Buicks looked, if you can believe it, too narrow to some customers. And remember, the 1961 Buicks were in fact narrower than the 1960 models. But in order to make the cars look wider, Bill Mitchell mandated that that bullet front end be dropped so that the headlights could be placed at the extreme ends of the vehicle, and thus the 1962 Buick front end was born. However, let's take a look back at some of the clay models that were executed by design staff for the 1961 Buick. The first being this one here with, I have no idea how you would describe this, horizontal fins up front, a huge wind split that runs the length of the car, bullets on the bumpers up front, as well as some scalloped fenders. You do see some of that bullet theme, although it's reversed here, more pointed toward the back as opposed to the front. So it appears that Buick stylists actually took the theme from what was going to be at the rear of the car and reversed it so that the bullets were pointing frontward. And if you can believe it, here's the rear of that same clay model. Take a look at what appears to be a jet engine exhaust in the middle of this rear end. Very similar to the LeSabre show car, if you will. but clearly just something that would have been super radical for the time. I like the taillights that are canted at maybe a 15-20 degree angle back there as well. The roofline is somewhat similar to what would be seen on the 1961 Buicks, but other than that, it's pretty different. There is that wind split that you can see, and that glass appears to almost be two pieces in this 1961 model. And the rear backlight, that glass just comes way up into the roof. That also, perhaps that theme was something that was inverted on the 1961s, as the front windshield ended up having that larger piece of glass, although there was no longer the wraparound windshield that the 1959 and 1960 Buicks had when the 61s were introduced. Here's another clay model for the 1961 Buick that came about a little bit later than the previous one that I was showing. Notice the bullet theme is still pointing backward on this one as opposed to the front end having that theme. The front end here does have quad headlights that appear a bit awkwardly spaced out. There seems to be too much gap between the low and high beams on these, but that's the proposal. You still have a bit of that horizontal fin up front, and the grille kind of just disappears into this slot in between the grille and the bumper. A curious theme overall. You can see the A-pillar, as I mentioned, and the front windshield now starting more to approximate the overall upper form that would be released for production. But still, this vehicle is far from production ready. A final theme that you can see here is, I think, actually a very, very tasteful theme. The headlights now are spaced more closely together, and the grille doesn't quite have that same air gap between the bumper as it did on the previous model, but it does have some. And I do love the eyebrows that the hood forms between the upper portion of the hood there in that plane and this lower plane where the headlights reside. You can see by this point that that bullet theme has been rotated forward, and the rear end is now approximating the production vehicle, as is the overall upper form of the car. I actually think that this design is quite tasteful, maybe even better than the production version. Let me know what you think in the comments section, but if this had been released for production, I think this would have been a super cool vehicle as well. Of course, the 1961 Buick didn't only have a handsome exterior, but it also had a pretty stunning and innovative interior, including Buick's Mirror Magic instrument panel. The speedometer was really a carryover from the 1960 model year, and interior designer George Moon came up with this design for what effectively was a rolling drum speedometer that was laid in a trench in front of a mirror that enabled the driver to adjust the mirror so that they could see the speedometer really no matter what height they were or what position the seat was in. You have to remember, back at this period of time, seat adjustments weren't all that great necessarily, and it was believed that executing the speedometer in this way would enable drivers to better see it. The interesting part about this, though, is because the speedometer is obviously reflected to the driver, it had to be printed backward as well as upside down so that it reflected correctly. And you can see that here in the photos of this particular speedometer that was taken out of a LeSabre found in a junkyard. While it was certainly cool, 1961 would represent the final year for this reflecting speedometer, as in 1962, Buick would transition to a more traditional horizontally oriented speedometer, as you can see here. Also was quite handsome, but not, let's say, as innovative as the 1960 and 61 models. Overall, 1961 wasn't a great year for Buick, and when it came to sales between these full-sizers, the LeSabre, the Invicta, and the big wheelbase Electra, Buick sold about 190,000 units in 1961. It would take until 1962 for Buick to really get some mojo back, when it sold about 245,000 units in that model year. In 1963, it would sell 269,000 units, and by 1964, Buick was selling 288,000 units just of these full-sizers, which by that time encompassed the LeSabre, the Wildcat, which had replaced the Invicta in the 1963 model year, and the Electra 225. Under hood, the Buicks had two different sizes of V8 engines, all nailhead configurations. If you got the LeSabre, you had a 364 cubic inch nailhead V8, and there were three different horsepower ratings, 235, 250, and 300 horsepower. The 1961 Invicta as well as Electra had a standard 401 cubic inch V8 that made 325 horsepower. The Nailhead was a great and smooth V8, but it would eventually be sunset after the 1966 model year because it couldn't simply be made larger than 425 cubic inches. And of course, this was a time period when Buick wanted to go larger in engine size as well as other automakers. So in 1967, Buick introduced its 430 cubic inch V8, which would eventually be enlarged to 455 cubic inches in 1970, the largest ever V8 placed in a Buick. This concludes our special on the 1961 Buick and its design. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Particularly put a comment in there if you think that speedometer is cool or the bullet nose theme up front. And until next time, thanks again and take care.